You remember when things used to surprise you. Not startle you. Surprise you. The kind of surprise that arrives with a small internal shift, a recalibration of something you thought you understood. A moment where the world showed you something you hadn't anticipated, and you felt, briefly, the particular aliveness that comes from not knowing what comes next. You probably can't remember exactly when that stopped being the default. It didn't happen suddenly. It happened the way most significant losses happen, gradually, then completely, then in retrospect. One day you realized that you'd been moving through your days without that feeling, that the last time something genuinely surprised you was longer ago than you'd like to admit, that the world had become not bad, not painful, just predictable, legible, a place you already knew how to read. Most people interpret this as a sign of experience, of wisdom, of having seen enough of the world to no longer be caught off guard by it. The neuroscience says something different. When the brain stops being surprised, something specific happens to the way it processes experience. Not a deepening, a narrowing. And the research on what that narrowing produces, across cognitive function, emotional range, creative capacity, and longevity, is uncomfortable enough that most people would rather call it wisdom than look at it directly. By the end of this, you'll understand exactly what happens when nothing surprises you anymore, what the brain loses, what the self loses, and, most importantly, whether any of it can be recovered. There's one finding from neuroscience research that most people have never heard of, documenting what happens to the brain when novelty disappears, that changes everything about how you should think about surprise, boredom, and the experience of being alive. We'll get there. Start with what surprise actually is. Not emotionally, neurologically. Surprise is the brain's response to a prediction error. Your brain does not passively receive information from the world. It actively predicts what it expects to receive, constructing, moment to moment, a model of what is about to happen based on everything it knows about how the world works. Every sensory input, every social interaction, every event in your day is filtered through this predictive model before it reaches conscious awareness. When reality matches the prediction, the brain registers it with minimal processing. The expected thing happened. No update required. Move on. When reality violates the prediction, when something happens that the model didn't anticipate, the brain fires a specific signal. Neuroscientists call it a prediction error signal. It originates primarily in the dopaminergic system, the same neural architecture that drives motivation and reward. And what this signal does is remarkable. It triggers a cascade of learning. The brain doesn't just register that it was wrong, it immediately begins updating its model, allocating attention, encoding the unexpected event more deeply than it would encode expected events, essentially flagging the surprise as information worth keeping, because if the model was wrong, the model needs to be improved. Surprise, at the neurological level, is the brain's primary learning mechanism. It is how the brain knows what it doesn't know yet. And here is the implication that most people miss entirely. A brain that stops being surprised is not a brain that has finished learning. It's a brain that has stopped updating its model, that has, somewhere along the way, decided that its current map of the world is accurate enough that new information can be processed with minimal attention. That decision, made not consciously but automatically, as a function of accumulated experience and reduced novelty, has consequences that extend far beyond occasional boredom. In the 1990s, neuroscientist Marion Diamond at UC Berkeley published research that would reshape how scientists think about brain development and decline. Diamond had been studying neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to physically change its structure in response to experience. What she found, across decades of research on both animal and human brains, was that the brain's structural complexity, the density of its neural connections, the elaboration of its dendrites, the richness of its cellular architecture, was directly correlated with the richness of the environment it was operating in. Brains in enriched environments, exposed to novelty, challenge, and unpredictability, showed measurably more complex neural architecture than brains in impoverished environments, even when the underlying genetic material was identical. The brain literally grows in response to the unexpected. And Diamond's follow-up research showed something equally important. Brains removed from enriched environments, returned to predictable, unstimulating conditions, began to show measurable structural decline. Not immediately, over time, but the decline was consistent and documented. The brain that stops being surprised doesn't maintain the complexity it built during periods of novelty. It begins slowly and largely invisibly to simplify. This is not aging in the conventional sense. Diamond documented it in young brains as well as old ones. The mechanism is not time, it's stimulation, or the absence of it. A young brain in a predictable environment declines in measurable complexity. An old brain in a genuinely stimulating environment maintains its architecture in ways that defy conventional expectations about cognitive aging. The variable is not age, it's surprise. But here's the layer of this that the neuroscience alone doesn't capture. Because the consequences of a life without surprise extend beyond cognitive function. They extend into something harder to measure but easier to feel. The quality of time itself. You've probably noticed this. The way time moves differently in different periods of your life. Childhood felt long. Not because the days were longer, because every day contained things you hadn't encountered before. Your brain was encoding constantly. Every experience was new enough to require genuine processing, to leave a trace, to take up space, to be remembered. Now consider the last year of your adult life. How much of it do you actually remember? Not in outline, the major events, the appointments, the milestones, the texture of it, the specific days, the particular Tuesday afternoons. For most adults past a certain point, the answer is not much. Neuroscientist David Eagleman at Stanford has studied this phenomenon extensively. His research on time perception suggests that the subjective experience of time, how long a period feels in retrospect, is directly related to the density of novel memories formed during that period. When you're doing new things, encountering new places, meeting new people, facing new challenges, your brain is encoding continuously. The memories accumulate, and in retrospect, the period feels long because there is so much of it to look back on. When you're doing the same things, in the same places, with the same people in the same patterns, your brain encodes minimally. The days pass without leaving much behind, and in retrospect, entire months can feel like they lasted a week. The life that nothing surprises you in is not a longer life, it's a shorter one. Not in years, in the experience of years. The subjective length of your life, the felt sense of how much life you actually lived, is a function of how much of it was new enough to be worth remembering. And a life of nothing surprising is a life the brain barely bothers to record. Now let's talk about what this does to the self, because cognitive decline and compressed time are measurable. But there's a third consequence of a surprise-free life that is harder to measure and more personally significant. What happens to curiosity? Psychologists who study curiosity, and it has become a serious research area in the last 2 decades, define it as the motivational state that drives exploration of the unknown, the desire to close an information gap, to find out what's on the other side of something you don't yet understand. Curiosity, like surprise, is dopaminergically driven. It's activated by the detection of something unknown, an information gap between what you know and what you sense is knowable. And here's the finding that connects curiosity research to the problem of nothing surprising you. A 2014 study from UC Davis, led by neuroscientist Charan Ranganath, found that curiosity doesn't just motivate learning in the moment. It fundamentally changes the quality of learning across all domains, including domains unrelated to the thing the person was curious about. Participants who were in a state of curiosity before a learning task showed significantly better memory, not just for the material they were curious about, but for incidental information they encountered during the same period. Information they hadn't been specifically trying to learn. The curiosity state primed the entire learning system. It made the brain more receptive, more attentive, more alive to what was happening around it. And the mechanism, Ranganath's team found, was the dopamine system, the same system activated by prediction errors, by surprise, by novelty. Curiosity, surprise, and novelty are not separate phenomena. They're different expressions of the same neural state, a state of openness to information the brain doesn't yet have. And a brain that stops being surprised stops being curious, not because it loses interest, because it stops detecting information gaps, because the model it's running has become confident enough that it stops registering what it doesn't know. The person who is never surprised is not a person who knows everything. They're a person whose brain has stopped noticing what it doesn't know. That is not wisdom. That is the beginning of a very specific kind of intellectual and experiential death. Here's the story that makes all of this concrete. In 2007, violinist Joshua Bell, one of the most celebrated classical musicians in the world, stood in a Washington, D.C. metro station during morning rush hour and played 6 Bach pieces on his Stradivarius violin for approximately 45 minutes. He was in jeans and a baseball cap. No sign, no announcement, just a man playing extraordinarily complex, extraordinarily beautiful music in a subway station. In 45 minutes, 1,097 people passed him. 7 stopped to listen for more than a minute. 1 person recognized him. The experiment, organized by Washington Post journalist Gene Weingarten, won a Pulitzer Prize, and the question it raised was not about art or music or even about Joshua Bell. It was about attention. Specifically, what had happened to the commuter's capacity to be surprised by something extraordinary in an ordinary context? Weingarten's conclusion, after interviewing many of the commuters, was not that they were indifferent to beauty. It was that their predictive model for what a subway station contained had become so fixed that it filtered out the information that didn't fit. A man playing violin in the metro was not surprising. Street musicians play in metro stations. The brain filed it accordingly and moved on. The extraordinariness of the music, the specific, rare, unrepeatable quality of what was happening, never made it past the filter. Because the filter had become too confident, too complete, too certain about what the world contained. A brain that is never surprised cannot receive the extraordinary when it arrives. It has learned to predict too well. So what do you do with this? The research does not suggest that surprise can be manufactured, that you can force your brain into a novelty detection state by scheduling unexpected experiences on a calendar. Manufactured novelty produces some of the right neurological effects, but the research consistently shows that the deepest and most sustained effects, the ones that actually update the predictive model rather than just temporarily stimulating it, come from genuine uncertainty, from situations where you actually don't know what's going to happen. And here's the uncomfortable implication. Genuine uncertainty requires genuine risk, not physical risk necessarily, but the kind of risk that comes from doing something you're not sure you can do, from entering situations where your existing model of how things work might be wrong, from allowing yourself to be a beginner at something, to not know, to be caught off guard. The people who remain genuinely surprisable into late life, who maintain the curiosity state, the novelty sensitivity, the openness to having their predictions violated, are not people who live chaotically. They're people who have deliberately and consistently chosen to operate at the edge of their competence, who have kept something in their lives that they haven't figured out yet. not because uncertainty is comfortable, because certainty, sustained long enough, produces a brain that has traded aliveness for efficiency. And efficiency without aliveness is just a very organized kind of quiet. You remember when things used to surprise you? That memory is not nostalgia for a simpler time. It's information about a neurological state you once had access to and may have been slowly, invisibly losing. The brain that built your current model of the world was a brain running on surprise, on prediction errors, on the constant recalibration that comes from encountering things it didn't expect. That brain is still in there. The architecture for novelty detection, for curiosity, for the particular aliveness of not knowing what comes next. It doesn't disappear with age or experience. It goes quiet when it stops being needed. The question is whether you're going to keep needing it. Not by seeking chaos, not by dismantling everything familiar, by keeping one door in your life that opens into something you don't yet understand. One question you haven't answered, one domain where you are still, genuinely, a beginner. Because the brain that has something left to learn is the brain that has something left to feel. And a life that can still surprise you is a life the brain considers worth recording. The surprise was never the point. The openness that made surprise possible, that's what you're actually after. Keep it open. There is a specific kind of person who never loses the capacity for surprise. Researchers who study cognitive aging have been trying to identify what distinguishes them for decades. The finding is not what most people expect. It's not intelligence, not education level, not socioeconomic status, not even the number of new experiences a person seeks out. It's a specific orientation toward their own understanding, a habit of mind that researchers call epistemic humility, the ongoing active acknowledgement that what you currently know is incomplete, that the model you're running could be wrong, that the next piece of information might change something you've considered settled. People with high epistemic humility don't stay curious because they're more curious by nature. They stay curious because they've built a relationship with their own knowledge that keeps the curiosity system active. They hold their conclusions loosely, not weakly, loosely. They commit to their best current understanding while remaining genuinely open to having it revised. And that openness, that maintained uncertainty about even their most confident beliefs, keeps the prediction error system sensitive, keeps the brain registering gaps, keeps the surprise mechanism from going quiet. The irony is complete and worth sitting with. The people who are hardest to surprise are the people who are most certain they know how things work. The people who remain surprisable indefinitely are the people who remain genuinely uncertain about how much they know. Certainty is comfortable, but it costs exactly the thing that made experience feel alive. There's one more dimension to this that the neuroscience points toward but doesn't fully explain. What surprise does to time, specifically to the experience of being present in time. When the predictive model is running smoothly, when everything is confirming expectations, the brain processes experience in a kind of compressed, efficient autopilot. You move through your day without fully arriving in it. The minutes pass. The hours pass. You look up, and it's evening, and you can't quite account for where the day went. This is not laziness. It's the brain doing exactly what it was designed to do, conserving resources by minimizing processing of expected inputs. But the consequence is a life that happens without you fully in it. When something unexpected occurs, when the prediction error fires, the brain snaps to full attention. Time slows, subjectively. The moment becomes dense with detail. You are suddenly, fully, undeniably here. This is why emergencies feel so vivid. Why travel to unfamiliar places compresses time in experience but expands it in memory. Why falling in love produces such an acute sense of aliveness. Because the other person keeps doing things you didn't predict, and the brain keeps having to update its model, and the updating is indistinguishable from presence. The surprise is not the point. The presence it produces is. And a life without surprise is a life where that quality of presence, that full arrival in the moment, becomes increasingly rare. Not because you've stopped caring, because the brain has stopped being called to attention. The question then becomes not just about cognitive health or the subjective length of a life, it becomes about the quality of being alive at all, about whether you are here, fully, attentively, genuinely here, in the moments that make up your days, or whether you are moving through a version of your life that the brain is processing efficiently, accurately, and almost entirely without you. The research on what pulls people back from this state, what restores the sensitivity to surprise in people who have lost it, points consistently toward one thing: contact with genuine otherness, not novelty for its own sake, not chaos or disruption or the deliberate dismantling of routine, but sustained, genuine contact with something or someone that operates by a logic different from your own. A person whose worldview is different from yours in ways you can't easily dismiss. A discipline you know nothing about and have no immediate reason to learn. A place where the rules you've internalized don't apply and you have to figure things out from the beginning. These encounters don't just produce occasional surprise, they actively retrain the predictive model, introducing uncertainty at a deep enough level that the brain is forced to hold its conclusions more loosely. To stay receptive, to keep the error detection system sensitive, they remind the brain that the map is not the territory, that the model is not the world, that there is always more out there than the current version of "you knows how to predict." And in that reminder, in that reactivated uncertainty, something returns that you may not have noticed was gone, the particular quality of attention that makes a Tuesday feel like it happened. That makes a conversation leave a trace. That makes the world look, briefly, like a place that still has things in it you haven't seen yet. That is what surprise was always for, not the jolt, not the novelty, the openness it kept alive. The world hasn't stopped being surprising. The question is whether you're still open enough to be surprised by it. If this is the kind of content that makes you think differently about your own mind, subscribe for new videos. There's more where this came from, and the next one goes somewhere you won't expect.